Death on the battlefield was swift, but for the wives left behind, the Vikings crafted fates so cruel, so degrading, that death itself seemed like a merciful escape. When Viking sails appeared on horizon, battle sealed men's fates in minutes. But for the wives of those who fell, survival was no blessing. Their dignity, freedom, and very identities became tools in the hands of conquerors, turned into living proof of their husbands' defeat. For the Vikings, victory was never complete with bloodshed. Alone, it was in the broken lives of women turned from wives to trophies that their domination was truly carved. The battlefield was never quiet while the fighting raged. It thundered, with axes striking shields, with men roaring, with the groans of the wounded. But when the final defender fell, and the smoke of burning homes drifted into the night, a different silence crept in. It was not peace, it was the silence of dread. For the wives of slain warriors, that silence was unbearable. Just hours earlier, their husbands had stood before them, swords raised in desperate defiance. Now those swords lay broken in the mud, and the men who had wielded them lay lifeless beside them. The women were left exposed unprotected in a world where protection meant everything. The Vikings thrived on this moment. To them, conquest wasn't only about treasure or livestock. True conquest meant stamping humiliation so deeply into the enemy that no recovery was possible. And the wives of the fallen were their canvas. Gold could be spent, land could be reclaimed, but the broken spirit of a conquered people, that endured. For these women, survival brought no relief. Imagine standing among the ruins of your village, the screams still echoing in your ears, when the very men who had slain your husband seized you by the arms. You realized in that moment that your life had not been spared, it had been claimed. Some were dragged before Viking leaders immediately, paraded as spoils of war. Others were left to watch in horror as their homes were looted, their children snatched from them, their lives dismantled piece by piece. The end of battle was not the end of terror. It was the beginning of a long, merciless ordeal. The cruelty was not just physical. It was psychological, designed to break more than the body. The Vikings made sure these women understood that they were no longer wives, no longer mothers, no longer daughters. They were property, proof of defeat, objects to be used and displayed. This was the silence after battle, the moment of realization, the collapse of hope. Death had passed them by, but what lay ahead was something far darker. Victory in Viking culture was not a private affair. It was spectacle, ritual, celebration, and the fate of conquered women became part of this theater. The wives of fallen warriors were paraded as living emblems of defeat. Some were dragged into longhouses during feasts, forced to pour ale for the same men who had butchered their husbands. Imagine their trembling hands carrying bowls of mead as warriors roared with laughter. Their grief turned into a performance for amusement. Every spill, every stumble was another reminder. You are no longer a person, you are a trophy. Humiliation was the point. To force a woman into servitude before her entire community was to desecrate her memory, her family, her lineage. For Viking warriors, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was dominance publicly sanctified. Some women were pushed further into ritual unions. They were declared wives of their captors. But these marriages were not bonds of love. They were acts of political theater. By taking the wife of a defeated enemy, a Viking sent a clear message. Your bloodline is mine now, your legacy carries my mark. Children born of these forced unions were celebrated by the victors. To them, it was proof that the enemy's lineage had been conquered from within. To the woman, it was a lifelong scar, a constant reminder that her body had been stolen and rewritten as part of the victor's pride. The humiliation extended beyond servitude and forced marriage. Some women were branded or tattooed, permanent marks declaring them property. Others, according to whispered sagas, were sacrificed outright, offered to the Viking gods, as if their suffering alone could sanctify victory. Each act stripped away another layer of their humanity. They were not merely enslaved. They were reshaped into living symbols of defeat. Every humiliation they endured became a celebration for their captors, every tear another offering to Viking pride. For the women there was no reprieve. They could not mourn, could not resist, could not even hold onto their identities. The humiliation was endless, deliberate, and devastating. And this was only the beginning. What came next went even deeper: chains, servitude, and torments that reached into both flesh and spirit. Once the feasting ended, once the laughter of victory quieted, the wives of the fallen faced their new reality: chains, some literal, some invisible, but all crushing. The Vikings called their slaves thralls, and many captured women were forced into this lowest caste of society. Yet even the word slave feels insufficient here, because this servitude was not just labor. It was humiliation repackaged as daily life. Imagine being ordered to scrub the wooden floor of a great hall where your husband once sat as a free man, where he once raised a drinking horn in pride. Now you kneel in silence, cleaning the mud from the boots of his killer. That is not labor. That is psychological warfare. These women cooked meals they weren't allowed to eat. They washed clothes for the warriors who mocked them. They were sent to tend livestock, fields, or worse, forced into roles designed solely to strip them of dignity. Some were made to serve naked at feasts, their shame displayed before cheering crowds. Others were given degrading nicknames, their true identities erased. In a society where one's name carried weight and legacy, this was erasure on a personal level. Servitude came with instability, too. There was no routine, no stability, no safety. A woman might be ordered to spin wool one day, only to be dragged to her master's bed the next, then beaten the following day for reasons she could not even guess. The unpredictability created a constant dread of terror that hung in the air like smoke, choking every breath. And then there were the children. When a woman bore a child by her captor, that child became a tool of humiliation. For the Vikings, this was triumph. Bloodlines rewritten, futures conquered. For the mother, it was torment. Every glance at her child was both love and grief, a reminder of her violation, a scar that walked beside her every day. But even in chains, fragments of resilience flickered. Some women learned to bargain with small favors, gathering whispers of gossip, clinging to scraps of agency where they could. Some formed secret bonds with other captives, sharing what little hope they had. A whispered prayer, a hidden lullaby from the old tongue, a secret refusal to forget who they once were. These were tiny acts of rebellion against the chains. Still, for most, the chains of servitude were not just iron links on their wrists or ankles. They were chains on the soul. They reduced a woman not merely to a laborer, but to a shadow of herself, broken, humiliated, and haunted by the memory of what she had lost. If chains reduced women to shadows, Viking rituals dragged them into the light, not to honor them, but to break them in front of all. These rituals turned suffering into theater, sanctified cruelty into religion. Some sagas whisper of ceremonies where women were forced to serve as public symbols of conquest. They were tied to posts in the center of villages, mocked, jeered, and degraded as offerings to the gods. The humiliation was not hidden, it was magnified, performed before entire communities to etch dominance into memory. In some cases, captives were forced into mock weddings. Dressed in rags, stripped of jewelry, they were married to their captors in ceremonies meant to ridicule their former status. These weren't unions, they were spectacles. The community watched, the gods were invoked, and the woman's broken dignity became a celebration of victory. And sometimes the rituals went further. Archaeological evidence tells of burials where women's remains were found alongside Viking men, their bones showing signs of strangulation or stabbing. These were sacrifices, lives offered to Odin, Thor, or Freyja to honor the conquest. To the Vikings, it was holy. To the victims, it was terror sanctified. Even those who survived such rituals carried scars deeper than wounds. Imagine being forced to sing laments at the funerals of the very men who had slain your husband. Imagine being ordered to praise your captor in song, your voice trembling as you speak words you don't believe. These rituals did not just degrade, they rewrote reality, forcing women to participate in their own humiliation. The purpose was clear, terror was power. By twisting religion and ritual into tools of cruelty, the Vikings ensured that their victories echoed beyond the battlefield. Each chant, each mockery, each ritual act became a reminder that resistance was not only futile, it was blasphemy. For the women trapped in this cycle, life became theater, their pain the performance, their broken spirits the offering. Every ritual carved their torment into memory so that their humiliation could never be forgotten, not by them, not by their communities, not by history itself. Silence can be heavier than screams. For many women, the greatest weapon used against them wasn't the sword or the chain. It was being forced into silence. In Viking culture, storytelling was power. To speak one story was to claim identity, to anchor memory. But for these wives, silence was demanded. They could not tell the sagas of their dead husbands. They could not sing the songs of their families. Their tongues were chained as tightly as their wrists. This silence had a cruel purpose. By erasing their voices, the conquerors erased their histories. What good is a proud lineage if no one is allowed to remember it? What meaning does loyalty hold if the story cannot be told? Every stolen word was another nail in the coffin of who they once were. Some women broke inside this silence. Days of labor passed into weeks, weeks into years, until memory itself began to fade. They forgot the exact shade of their father's hair, the sound of their husband's laugh, the rhythm of their childhood songs. It was not just the body enslaved, it was memory itself. Others resisted in subtle ways. A carved rune hidden on a wall. A lullaby hummed quietly to a child, disguised as a Viking tune, but carrying the melody of their homeland. These were acts of defiance so small they seemed invisible, but they mattered. They meant that even in silence, identity survived. But silence had another darker side. It isolated. Many women were forced to live apart, separated from those who shared their pain. Without voices to connect them, despair grew. Alone, each believed her suffering was unique, unbearable, inescapable. And that belief, perhaps more than any chain, kept them broken. Psychologists today call this learned helplessness, when repeated trauma convinces the victim that resistance is impossible. The Vikings didn't need textbooks to understand it, they practiced it instinctively. The silence they demanded became the cage they built, one that trapped not just the body but the very spirit. And so the women carried the weight of silence, a burden heavier than any stone, because it crushed from the inside. Their stories were stolen, their voices smothered, their identities rewritten. Death was swift, silence was eternal. For those who survived the silence, the next cruelty was assimilation. The conquerors wanted not just slaves, they wanted replacements, echoes of themselves. Assimilation